Jerry Agar for Ezra Levant. How much does the job of Indian chief pay? Is that any of our business? Perhaps, given that chiefs are calling for and claiming to be subject to transparency, it's a legitimate question. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is asking, and there Colin Craig joins me now. Colin, it has become, I think, a very legitimate question to ask.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the chiefs and councillors out there on reserves are getting paid with public dollars, so it's fair for taxpayers to ask what's going on. But we also hear quite often from grassroots band members saying, hey, we want to know how much your chiefs and councillors are making, and in many cases they've been refused the information.
Well, and as you point out, and we're going to have some numbers here that we can put up on the screen, that the chiefs are paid from more than one source, and in some cases maybe it's a little difficult actually to determine what the total is. You have on this chart here some question marks: the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, the Tribal Council Investment Group. Are you saying it's possible they actually contributed as well to Chief Glenn Hudson, but you don't know?
Oh, it is possible. And you've got a great graphic here. I mean, this is the chief from the Peguis Reserve in Manitoba. So this is an example of what we're talking about. You can see he gets money from his own community, about $111,000 tax-free. And then he gets another $82,000 or so in travel expenses, some of which could actually be pay for traveling as well. We're not sure. But then there's a lot of other sources where he has received compensation from. So you can see it in the graphic, that there's a couple other bodies where he sits on those committees as a chief and he's getting pay. So if you only look at how much he's getting from the community, you're not getting the full story, because some chiefs are getting money from these other bodies. So we tried to get the numbers from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. That's the organization for all the chiefs in Manitoba. And we got the information from the federal government, but all the chief and council pay information is blacked out. So, I mean, maybe there's pay there, maybe there isn't, maybe it's only a reimbursement for actual travel costs. Who knows? But our push has always been that politicians across the country at any level of government should have to disclose their pay and expenses to the public.
Well, absolutely, and they are politicians, and I think sometimes people forget that, and my suspicion would be, now this is just me, but if there were numbers redacted, if you got documents with blacked out portions, then I think we can assume that there is more money. Otherwise they would knowing what you're trying to put together, they would disclose that it was nothing. And I think it's important to re-emphasize something you just mentioned in passing. This is tax-free compensation, so when you compare it to another politician, and we'll do so with the Premier of the province of Manitoba, you're talking about having to add back in as to what kind of salary that would be for pretty much anybody else.
Well, exactly. I mean, you can't just look at the numbers and say, oh, okay, well, let's compare that with an off-reserve politician. You have to remember it's tax-free, so you have to do the equation, or the calculations to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And when you do, take a look at the chart right there, $141,000 for Premier Greg Selinger, that's Manitoba's Premier. And by comparison, this chief was making an off-reserve equivalent of amount of over $200,000.
And what are all those travel expenses for? Because, if you're a chief in Nunavut, and you might have to have some pretty hefty travel expenses. It's expensive to travel out of a place like that if you are going to go to Ottawa or someplace. But we're talking about a chief here who lives probably not that bad a drive outside of Winnipeg.
Yeah, it's not too far. I mean, this isn't one of the extremely remote communities where you could understand, okay, it's $1,000 just to get there by flight. I mean, this is a community that's, I believe it's about a 2-hour drive from Winnipeg. So, I mean, to see $100,000 worth of travel expenses, I mean, that's just astronomical, especially when you compare it to, Manitoba's Premier, who is representing over 1.2 million people. I mean, this chief in particular is representing just over 3,000 people. So,
well, and what I find,
number.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What I find so egregious about this is that, as we've seen in Ontario with Chief Spence in Attawapiskat, is that you have chiefs crying poor. We need more money. Our people are devastated. They're living in third world conditions. Well, the chief isn't.
Not in this case. I mean, this guy is known for having a high salary. We worked with some whistleblowers from the community a few years ago. The numbers were even worse back then. I mean, he was making more than the Prime Minister of the country. Now he appears to only be making more than the Premier. So things are getting mildly better. So this, there's a tiny bit of good news there. It's not as good as what we've seen in some other communities where the numbers get exposed. These guys get outed for how much they're making, and then they get turfed at the next election. But yeah, I mean, you're bang on. These numbers are just off the charts.
Well, sure, and these numbers are important to know, as you point out, Colin, that we need to know what politicians make in salary, how much they have in expenses, so you can find out if it's reasonable. Their reasonable expenses should be covered. But I think the group that really needs to know what these numbers are the group of people who the chiefs purport to represent. They are, in fact, in many cases, living in devastated circumstances, perhaps not realizing that the chief is rich.
Exactly. I mean, we've uncovered or helped uncover many cases where chief and councillors were making huge sums of money, like just off the charts, you know, to the point where you wonder how they're sleeping at night when so many of their people are just living in squalor.
Comfortably is how they're sleeping at night.
Yeah, and we expose what's going on, and then, you know, the band members are just, you know, so like irate because they had no idea what was happening. So, I mean, we've worked on a lot of cases like that. We've also shined a light on some of the really good chiefs and councillors out there, because there's some that are just doing wonderful things for their communities, and they're not like these bad apples. But what transparency will do is it will help everyone sort out who the good chiefs and councillors are from the ones that are just in it to line their own pockets.
Sure, a chief shouldn't have to take a vow of poverty, neither should any politician. A reasonable salary and reasonable travel expenses, etc., should be covered. That's, of course, a subjective thing in terms of what everybody thinks is the reasonable number, but you compare it to other politicians, that's where you arrive at a reasonable number. So thanks so much for the exposure you've given this, and thanks for your time.
Well, thanks a lot, Jerry.